So as we were eating nuts in preparation for this conversation, I was telling you about a sort of like a bit of an emotional process that I'm going through right now, where we have a house that's been in the family for 100 years that is a lovely, beautiful house, not that far from where you live, and that my daughter was actually born in that front room. And on a stormy day in August, and the skies cleared, and a rainbow appeared, and the bluefish started jumping, and all this kind of beautiful, bucolic kind of scene. And we've had so many memories there, and but it's a completely irrational thing to own and to have and to maintain. And so, to satisfy sort of our rational brain, um, we've been sort of pathetically trying to sell it for a long time in an effort really not to sell it. And then, sort of lo and behold, someone came along and did purchase it. And we're just going to contract now. And, you know, dealing with this idea of letting go of something in the material world that does legitimately hold, I guess, what you might think of as you might define as something sacred. And I guess my question would be is like, when do things in the material world hold like a symbolic value that is real and important and not just kind of fleeting and ephemeral?
It's not just a symbolic value. You could ask the same question about your old dog. This dog is, well, I have a sentimental attachment to it. It's been in the family for a long time, but it can no longer do the work that the dog used to do to corral the chickens or whatever it did. Um, so rationally, there's no reason to keep maintaining this dog. Why don't we just put it down? We don't think that, like, we wouldn't do that for a beloved dog or your grandmother or something like that. But for a house, that's okay, right? Because this house is not a being, it's just a material thing. This devaluation of materiality, I think, is a problem.
Mm.
It's not to
Mm.
say that you should treat a house the same way you should treat a dog or a human being, but it's to ask, what is the right way to treat the house? You can't, by analogy, give it the same treatment you would give your grandmother, but to even consider that there is a right way to do it that takes into account the house as being, and not just as symbol, what it means to you, but to actually be in a relationship to it. And what I was proposing to you before is that you understand this potentially as a breakup, like a breakup with someone that you really love. And how do you go about that breakup? And why would you break up with somebody? Maybe you are ready to go your separate ways. But I think that whether or not, and maybe you're not ready to break up. Maybe you realize, but either way,
Yeah.
if you do understand it as a breakup, then you'll be able to go through whatever ritual or process you need to so that you feel okay with it.
Right. And I suppose that my individual plight, my petty little life, is just, a speck on the top of a pinhead. But that this notion of letting go, of moving on, I think anyone can see their story in that. And and is there ways to essentially instill these things with meaning? And I like, for example, you talk about something, inanimate objects or material objects that we can sort of almost toss them away as if they don't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, they have a life to them, right? So, how do what is that process of grace in a breakup?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty bad habit to treat the material things of the world as if they don't matter.
Yeah.
Because collectively, as humanity, we are now treating the planet as if it were some material thing that doesn't matter.
Right.
And this ideal of the separate self kind of floating above materiality, and yeah, I moved from this house to that house and I'm not attached. I'm not attached to this thing. I'm not attached to anything material. This is a conceit. This kind of independence is a conceit, because you could apply it to human beings too. And there are, I think, distorted spiritual teachings that counsel us to avoid attachment. But I think that to avoid attachment is to avoid being fully alive. And that real life isn't about protecting yourself from the pain of loss, but it's really going in there and fully loving, and knowing that you're going to lose everything that you love, and being willing to go through the grief of that.
Ooh, yes.
Then you've lived.
Yes. I read that Eric Fromm wrote something about this, which is like, there is a way not to grieve, but the only option not to grieve is also not to love.
Yeah.
And who would want that life? And then, but then that brings up something for me that I really have been grappling with, and I talked about it with your wonderful team around the table too late into the evening last night, which is this notion of non-attachment, and that on some level that, and this is, speaks directly to Buddhism, I suppose, that, we are all constantly distracted by desire, and desire, this sort of incessant desire, is at the core of suffering. I'm like fidgeting around in my chair just to always kind of elicit some sort of pleasant feeling, all the way up to like, I need my McMansion in the hills. And that essentially you can cultivate practice to sort of separate yourself from this desire and find what I guess one might call consciousness, something outside of your thoughts, feelings, objects that you perceive through your limited five senses. And that then in this kind of seat of the soul, in this true self, there is this awareness. And one of the things that I have been trying to grapple with is this. Is the fundamental nature of consciousness good, or is it neutral? Essentially, if you can cultivate that true awareness outside of feelings, emotions, objects, is that characterized by love, compassion, empathy, or is it something that is just purely neutral and focusable on good, fear, evil, da-da-da?
The default state of existence is bliss. Everything else is a temporary excursion away from that. Which doesn't mean that these excursions are a mistake. Ultimately, they feed an evolutionary process where life and the universe become more and more alive, and being becomes more and more existent, more and more complex, more and more related, more and more full. So the question then becomes, okay, yeah, desire births suffering, but maybe this whole journey into suffering, this whole excursion, is happening for a reason. It's what I was just saying about plunging into life. And okay, another way to look at it is, okay, so yeah, say desire causes suffering, but what are you going to do with that information? Can you exercise your will to suppress desire?
Yeah.
Or could it be that desire needs to be fulfilled and exposed for its false premises before you can even transcend it? And that doesn't mean you're transcending all desire. Maybe it means you're just transcending this desire. I think that the problem isn't desire. The problem is that the primal energy of desire gets diverted onto false objects that don't actually meet the desire, like the McMansion in the hills.
Right.
You know, what's the real desire there? It's probably not for the McMansion in the hills, because if it were, you would live happily ever after if you had that.
Yes.
But the same hunger that is grasping for the mansion in the hills isn't satisfied by the mansion in the hills.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe what it really wants is the feeling of being at home in the world.
Right.
But don't know how to get that, don't even know what that is, so I'll go for the mansion. But maybe even to realize that that is what I wanted all along requires that you first get the mansion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's funny, I saw like a heat map of one of these McMansions of where people actually spend their time in the McMansion.
The breakfast nook.
It was clustered in the breakfast nook and the bed. And then there's, 10,000 square feet of space that never get used. And because they never get used, because it feels so foreign. And that, yes, I think, what you're saying, and I think what we might agree upon is that we are essentially always pursuing happiness through the accumulation of goods and services that will never really serve us. And I want to go back, because something that I feel that is so fundamental to your philosophical approach on the human condition is separation and the separate self. So I wonder if you could just, I don't want to make you regurgitate that for the 50,000th time, but I think because it is so fundamental, I'd love for you to talk about kind of what that means and sort of how we got there, and then play that forward into modern society. What are the implications of it? How do we address it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the separate self is the myth that underlies our entire civilization. All of our systems and institutions tap into the myth of separation. And I mean myth, not in the sense of some, fantasy, some ridiculous thing.
Aeschylus.
But a myth in terms of a story that explains the world. Mm. So the story of separation explains who you are. You're a separate individual. You are a soul encased in flesh. You are a Cartesian mote of consciousness, et cetera, et cetera. It answers the question, why are you here? It's to survive, to reproduce, to maximize your self-interest. There's really almost no why you're here in this story. It says it answers the question, what is the way to live? And what are human beings for? And what constitutes progress? And it is that humans are separate from nature, destined to rise above nature, to dominate nature, to transcend nature, to harness natural forces, to someday no longer need nature. It also says what the nature of reality is and how change happens in the world. What are the ruling powers of this world?
Right.
It's forces in the story of separation. And I could go on. And often what I do in my work is I say, okay, how exactly does that basic paradigm inform our medical system or our economic system,
right,
or our spirituality or our politics? And you can see the traces of separation in all of these institutions.
Yes. I suppose one could trace the sort of evolution of the notion of the separate self to various inflection points in history, from, forager to agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, and surplus and primogenitorism, and this is mine and not yours.
Right, division of labor, social classes, money, writing, technology, et cetera, yeah.
Right. And do you feel that essentially, and this is something I've been also grappling with a bit, which is that the Enlightenment, which essentially has been the most influential philosophical movement into that sort of governs modern life that essentially has sanctified the virtues of the individual, that the individual should decide who governs, that the customer is always right, that beauty is always in the eye of the beholder, like all of these things that consistently sanctify the individual's point of view. That the individualism, freedom, that increasingly gets defined as my ability to own property and to like accrue, that is alloyed in some way with sort of science, reason, a sort of rational-based systems or thoughts that create systems and structures around that define you and me as separate, around scarcity, which you talk a lot about, through sort of a mutually beneficial transactional relationship between each other, and that it is that system, which I suppose is embodied in modern capitalism, consumerist culture, that leads us continually on this road, pathway of separateness, of individual materialism. And would you say that in order to undo that, to ungird that, do we need a new movement of reinstilling universal truths and principles into our life? Essentially, I'm not championing the Middle Ages or faith-based approaches to veracity, but it feels like we live in a completely relativist society where there are no values. And so we just are on this treadmill. And I wonder, what do we need?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the scope of that question is very broad. I'm just going to pick on maybe one little piece of it.
Yeah.
That was brought to mind before when you talked about our projection of meaning onto the world. I can't remember exactly how you put it, but this is part of one of it's one of the currents of the story of separation that says that meaning is created by human beings and projected onto the world because the world itself does not have meaning or intelligence or design or anything like that. It's just the result of random processes that don't have consciousness or purpose.
Right.
In themselves.
Teleology, yeah.
Right. So this is a kind of anthropocentrism.
Right.
That
yeah.
It's oddly enough, we think that anthropocentrism began to turn with Copernicus, where humans were no longer at the center of the cosmos. But scientific ideology still centers us in an even more profound way as the sole possessors of consciousness or intelligence.
Right.
It speaks to this helplessness that I hear so often of what are we going to do about this?
Yeah, right.
As if it were up to us. So you inquired, how do we launch a movement or to reverse the tide of separation? Because it seems like it's going to take some mighty effort to accomplish this turnaround. But you know what? The current story did not result from a mighty, intentional, purposeful effort. Right. So it's not like we got down and said, okay, things aren't going very well. Let's launch the story of separation. The alternative understanding is that we are carried by a process and a movement that is much, much bigger than anything that we can create or intend. That is to step back from this anthropocentrism. It's not, our future is not fundamentally what we are consciously creating. And this goes against a lot of spiritual teachings where you become the conscious creator of your reality.
Right.
Where do we get that arrogance? I think it is an extension of the technological mindset, which is that we're going to put the human stamp onto the disordered, chaotic, wild world outside of ourselves. So we want to do the same individually through these spiritual practices and collectively by creating a vision of the future and stamping that onto the future. I think that's just as necessary as it is for a fetus, a baby is being born, to make sure that that birth happens. It's not that the fetus has no role. It's easier to give birth to a live baby than to a stillborn, because the livingness of the baby responds to the contractions, the birth process of the mother. And that response is itself part of the process. So right now, like a baby being born, we are subject to what we experience as titanic forces. And we don't know what's happening to us, and we don't know what to do, but we respond to those in whatever way that we know how. We understand those in the way that we understand them, responding accordingly. We have no idea really what's going on here. Part of our response is to make meanings and to try to impose them onto what's happening, to try to control what's happening. It's not bad to do that. That itself is part of the response. And to say we're not going to try to control it is itself a form of control. And this search for, okay, what are we supposed to do now? It taps into the lineage of our role is to be the doers.
The doer, yeah.
Yeah. And that is necessary when, sorry to run on here, but
no, this is good.
That's necessary when there is no larger doing that we can participate in. And what I'm offering is, at the current stage right now, not to stop doing and stop responding, but we are being carried by an inconceivable, mysterious process.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, because in some ways it defies the instinct that I have of like, we need a spiritual awakening. That I just read, it was Martin Luther King Day on Monday. I took a little bit of time to actually read, imagine that, the letter from a Birmingham jail, where he essentially is addressing a bunch of clergy in Birmingham that are essentially speaking out against marching, against passive resistance and nonviolence and everything that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was doing with Martin Luther King. And so he writes this response from the Birmingham jail, which is essentially like, we are all connected. That essentially, if my daughter can read, but your daughters can't, then I am poor. Essentially interconnected, interdependent, spiritual messages, come to the fore that have over time addressed the salient societal problems or issues where, like if you look at slavery, the abolition movement had its roots in Quakerism. I mean, oftentimes when we hit these loggerheads, that the answers tend to lie in our spiritual underpinnings. And, and I want to talk about politics, because I don't think the change is going to come from there. But I think what's interesting about what you're saying is that you're like, Jeff, no, don't wait. Jesus is not going to roll in and say like, oh, everybody, we've been misguided. Here again are your universal truths. Everyone get back in line. Capitalism's built some nice plumbing for society to function, but we're pumping shit through it. You got to like work through a lens of these values and you'll be cool. But what I'm hearing is that that's not going to come from us necessarily.
It is being born within us and from us. It's not something that we can engineer. Our engineering efforts are part of it, but it is itself beyond our engineering. It's beyond our contrivance. It's beyond our understanding. We can understand it maybe in retrospect, maybe in hundreds of years now, we can name, here's what the transition was. But from where we are now, we cannot map it out. We cannot plan it. And therefore, current politics in terms of, okay, let's form some policies that are going to bring us through this transition, all of those will fall woefully short of the task. However, we can also sense that there is a destination. Otherwise, we would have no hope. The hope doesn't come from any rational projection that we can make it through the current emergency, because what we need to make it through doesn't even exist in the vocabulary of reason as society accepts it. I'm not saying it's irrational, but according to the premises that the old story of separation establishes, it is impossible. According to what that's part of the myth. The myth tells us what's possible and what isn't. According to what it says is possible, there's no way. There's no way anything's ever going to change. I mean, is it possible for there to be true peace in the Mideast, say between Israelis and Palestinians? I'm not talking like a ceasefire. I'm talking about brotherhood.
Right.
I'm talking about
fraternity,
forgiveness.
Yes.
Yeah, redemption,
Right.
healing. Is that, it's not even like the most modest peace proposals seem to be politically naive. So it's impossible, according to what we have established in our common perception as possible.
Right.
So that means that anything that we can constitute politically won't reach anywhere close to the destination that we paradoxically know exists. Therefore, to get to that destination, we have to accept a different guidance, a guidance that lies outside the realm of what we have agreed is possible. We have some help in this journey because most people that I meet anyway have in fact experienced the impossible. They've experienced things that the old story embodied in science tells them is possible. So, it tells them is impossible. So,
Right.
And these anomalous experiences, it's as if they are coming from the future. And each one that we experience creates a thread linking present with that particular future. These are the signposts, the breadcrumbs that we can follow to reach a place that we don't know how to reach.
But when is this coming, Charles? And is it going to be too late? I mean, that's very anthropocentric in and of itself, just the question. And I suppose, I think, from what I'm hearing is that not to discount the millions of people's lives that would be affected between, let's say, a Donald Trump presidency and an Elizabeth Warren presidency, that there are minimum wage and healthcare and, essentially millions of people's lives that would be affected that I don't want to discount. But you might say that we're talking about very narrow goalposts that separate these two figures, even though their countenance couldn't be more different at some level. And that the new story will emerge outside those narrow parameters, sort of, from MSNBC on one side and Fox on the other side. It would be like, tight little parentheses.
Right. Yeah. Outside that, politics, that spectrum from right to left is a one-dimensional spectrum.
Right. Yeah.
So the future that we want isn't only outside those two poles, but on the same axis. It's totally in a different dimension.
Yes.
The things that need to happen are not even considered political issues.
Right. They're essentially spiritual issues, potentially.
Or they could be, you could see them as being part of a different kind of politics, but we talked about this in the course, what's left out of the conversation when we define the issues as being a certain set of positions.
Right.
Like, Obamacare, should it be repealed or not? Well, what gets left out is the entire universe of holistic and alternative treatments. I mean, we don't question the healthcare system itself. It's just kind of like who pays for it. Mm-hmm. Or if we're talking about education, more or less public funding, does that even consider the question of school as an institution of the industrial age to train people to be compliant, obedient factory workers? Or if we're talking about, we can go down the line. I think the most important issues today are not really discussed because the spectacle, the froth, and controversy mesmerizes us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Marianne Williamson says we keep watering the leaves, but not the roots. It's not that we're not interested in exhuming the roots, but I don't think, and this is certainly not what mass media is interested in. So it needs to be sort of a self-propelled journey to look deeper. I'm Jeff Krasno, and welcome to Commune, where every week we explore the ideas, values, and practices that bring us together and help us live healthy and purpose-filled lives. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We hope you'll join us.